Welcome back into the Daily Dose. I am Jeff Hansen. As always, the show is brought to you by Give'emHellBrigham.com and by CougarSportsInsider.com, part of the 24/7 Sports Network. Thank you so much for your support of the show so far. Thank you to all of you who have subscribed, who have liked videos, shared videos, commented, who have fueled the algorithm. It means the world to me that you would support me so far, and I appreciate your support going forward. If you haven't done so yet, jump on board, subscribe. It's never too late. We are always open to newcomers here on the Daily Dose bandwagon. So join us. You're not going to want to miss the content we have prepped for you this season. It's not going to be anywhere better to be a BYU fan than right here at the Daily Dose and Give'emHellBrigham.com. Today is a big day. Today's June 30th. If you're a BYU fan, you already know what tomorrow represents. Tomorrow is the official day that BYU and Houston, Cincinnati, UCF join the Big 12 Conference. If you're a Cougar fan, every outlet that you pay attention to, from KSL to 1280 to the Deseret News, the Tribune, everybody is going to be talking about the Big 12. You are going to have so much BYU to the Big 12 content that you might be sick of the conference by July 2nd. That's how big this weekend is. That's how much content there will be. It will be a great, fun time to be a BYU fan. But before we do that, I want to take one last minute, one last day to pay homage to three of the most important players of the independence era. This does not necessarily mean these are the three best players. There's certainly lots of players who I'm not going to talk about today. Guys like Fred Warner, they're not these three players. Fred Warner is an all-timer at BYU. There's no question about it. But I want to talk about three guys who are a little bit different. Three guys who I believe carried BYU's fan interest throughout the independence era. If you think of what BYU dealt with over the course of the last 11, 12 years of independence, BYU, their hated rival, Utah, joined the Pac-12, became a Power 5 member, and then went on to have unprecedented success at their institution. They'd never reached the heights that they've reached over the last couple of years. It's been great for Utah. BYU has had to sit for the last 12 years and be told that they are a tier below the Utes forever. Not just by Utah and Utah fans, but by the media, by everybody else. You've seen BYU players, legends, Jason Buck, who have defected, right? Who talked about BYU having no future as a college football independent, talked about BYU not having anything to play for. And whether there was validity to those arguments or not, whether you agreed with those arguments or not, that was what BYU was up against. That's what people were saying about the Cougars. You had a coach in Bronco Mendenhall who was a legendary coach who did great things for BYU. But ultimately, even he did not believe in independence and the future of the Cougars, and he took another job elsewhere. So BYU fans, there were lots of reasons to stop paying attention, to stop tuning in and going to games. There were a ton of reasons to do so, but BYU fans maintained interest. It got pretty bleak there in 2017, first time in my life that I could remember that San Jose State game that BYU hit less than 50,000 in attendance at LaVell Edwards Stadium. But BYU fans largely stayed interested in their program, stayed motivated for the Cougars, and I think there were a few players that helped them do so. And as we move to the Big 12, fans, take a minute. Pat yourselves on the back, because without the fan interest over the last 12 years in kind of this weird college football no man's land, I don't think the Big 12 immediately jumps and grabs BYU. If fans disengage with BYU over independence, I don't think that the Big 12 comes calling. So kudos to everybody who is a BYU fan who's remained interested over the last 12 years. And let's pay homage to some of the players who helped us stay interested. Think back to Jimmer Fredette when it was still Mountain West Conference days, but think back to Jimmer. BYU had a good basketball team, but there were lots of really good basketball teams. There's always lots of good basketball teams. But people across the country tuned in to watch BYU basketball because of Jimmer. They weren't watching BYU basketball. That was a byproduct. They were watching Jimmer. There were players, I think, that were like that for BYU, that no matter, or for BYU football, rather, no matter what happened, no matter who BYU was playing against, no matter whether it was a win or a loss, no matter what the team's record was that season, there were three guys that I believe carried fan interest through thick and thin over the last 12 years. And it starts with Kyle Van Noy. Kyle Van Noy was obviously a BYU legend. There's no question about it. Kyle Van Noy is one of the most interesting people to listen to. His interviews were great. People like to hear from him, but his highlight plays, like his ability to make big plays at big moments, was unprecedented from a BYU linebacker. No matter what the situation was, BYU fans felt like they were still in the game, even when the offense was on the sideline, because you had Kyle Van Noy. He was must-see TV for BYU fans. Throughout his career, 226 tackles, 25 sacks, 61 and a half tackles for loss, 7 interceptions, 4 fumble recoveries. Let's take a deep breath because the stat line is so long. 5 forced fumbles and 5 defensive touchdowns. Kyle Van Noy was must-see TV. And because of Kyle Van Noy, BYU fans kept tuning in. I get it. He played on some pretty good teams. There were lots of players, Danny Sorensen, Cody Hoffman, Riley Nelson. There were lots of players that were worth watching during Kyle Van Noy's BYU career. But it was Kyle Van Noy who was a highlight reel that you felt like you could not miss because of how good he was and how exciting of a player he was at BYU. Next, Taysom Hill. There's no question that Taysom Hill was one of these guys. No matter what BYU did from a wins and losses standpoint, you were waiting for Taysom Hill to make that next big run. You were waiting for Taysom Hill to hurdle the next Texas defender. Taysom was awesome. And people across the country paid attention to BYU, even if BYU wasn't very good as a team, because of Taysom Hill. That's how exciting he was. That's how different he was for BYU. And I really, truly believe that without Taysom Hill coming into the program when he did and doing the things that he did, I don't know that BYU fans continue to stay as interested in BYU football as they were. BYU fans a great fan base. I'm not saying anything like that, but those were the doldrums of college football independence. 2016 is when the Big 12 Conference turned down expansion in BYU again, right? And at that point, it felt pretty hopeless. It did not feel like fun to be a BYU fan, but we kept tuning in. People kept showing up, and I believe that Taysom Hill is a large reason why. Nearly 7,000 career passing yards, which when you think about it, as much time as he spent injured and as much as his highlight plays are on the ground as a runner, nearly 7,000 career passing yards is pretty impressive. 43 passing touchdowns, 2,815 rushing yards, and 32 additional rushing touchdowns. Taysom Hill accounted for 75 touchdowns in his career. An absolutely transcendent player and a very big deal for BYU. A legend in all senses of the word. I believe he carried BYU through that era, or through those particular years of college football independence. And finally, Zach Wilson. That 2020 season was special. COVID was happening. Nobody knew what was going to play. We all know the story. But what Zach Wilson did on the football field that season, I believe, reinvigorated a fan base. Yes, he got drafted, and yes, he went on to the Jets, and his NFL career has been what it has been. But when he was there at BYU, people who were disengaged, people who had lost interest, people who pined for Power 5 conferences or the good old days in the Mountain West, they changed their minds when Zach Wilson was playing in that 2020 season. Yeah, the schedule was what it was, but Zach Wilson was phenomenal. For his career, Zach Wilson, 7,652 passing yards, 56 passing touchdowns, and then in 2020, a completion percentage of 73.5%. Zach Wilson was special. And Zach Wilson, I believe, was one of the players who carried BYU through his career, who was must-see TV for BYU fans, that no matter what the situation was, even if it was a Northern Illinois game and he was a freshman, or even if it was a game against Western Kentucky in front of no fans, Zach Wilson made BYU fans want to tune in. There are lots of other players who were very good during BYU's independence era. Jamal Williams was special. Cody Hoffman was special. Jaron Hall, Tyler Algier, special players. But I really believe that Zach Wilson, Kyle Van Noy, Taysom Hill, they had that Jimmer effect, that BYU fans tuned in to watch them. And they helped keep a fan base engaged when there were lots of reasons to disengage as a fan base. And ultimately, as of tomorrow, all of that fan engagement and staying engaged and captivated and tuned into BYU football will finally pay off when the Cougars are members of the Big 12 Conference. Thank you for tuning in and engaging with us here at the Daily Dose. And until next time, give them hell.